Teacher publicly mocks black student with hard math problem, unaware of his genius-level IQ. A teacher mocked a quiet black boy in front of the whole class, but what happened next left the entire room speechless. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. They thought he was just another distracted kid. Turns out he was a hidden genius, and today they would all witness what the world so often overlooks. Stay with us. This story will change how you see silence. Genius black boy mocked in class, until he stunned them all. The late morning sun slid lazily through the dusty windows of room 3002, casting faint golden stripes across the scratched linoleum floor. The chatter of eighth graders echoed through the walls, half whispers, half laughter. But in the far back corner, tucked near a window that opened to a restless row of trees, sat a boy so still he might have been missed entirely. Jamal Carter, 13 years old, a black boy with deep brown skin and sharper eyes than anyone knew. His face, reflected faintly in the classroom glass, stared not at the teacher or the board, but at the wind swaying through the leaves outside. There was a quiet to him, a quiet that made teachers dismiss him and made classmates forget his name. To most of the world inside that room, Jamal was invisible. Yet inside his notebook, beneath blank lines left untouched by the classwork of the day, a different story was being written. Scrawled across the margins were dense equations, advanced notations, puzzles with answers only he would understand. Jamal's mind worked at a different speed, a kind of brilliance that didn't shout or wave its hands. It watched. It waited. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Amanda Thompson, a woman of order and sharp edges. Her hair was tight, her blazer stiffer than the mood, and her eyes were scanning the classroom like a general ready to call out her troops. She slapped a pile of graded tests onto her desk with a sigh heavy enough to silence the room. "Some of you," she said, her voice slicing through the air like chalk against stone, "did okay. Others clearly need to start taking this class seriously." Jamal didn't flinch. His chin rested in his hand, eyes still at the window. It wasn't rebellion, it was boredom. He had already solved the kind of equations the class was still learning to read. But Mrs. Thompson didn't see that. She saw a boy not paying attention. A boy she had already filed away under the label, potential wasted. And then her eyes landed on him, Jamal Carter. His name cracked across the room like a ruler on a desk. Jamal blinked, pulled slowly back from the breeze and branches outside. His classmates turned. Some were smirking already. "Yes, ma'am," he said, voice quiet, uncertain. "You seem far more interested in the birds than in your education today." Her words had an edge, the kind of tone that made even the desks seem to sit up straighter. "Let's test just how much you've been learning." A low ripple of amusement stirred through the room. "Come up here." Jamal hesitated. He didn't like being watched. The weight of eyes always made his throat tighten. Still, he stood. The legs of his chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed it back, sending another round of whispers darting between desks. "She's gonna roast him," someone mumbled. Jamal walked forward. Each step felt longer than the last. The distance from the window to the board might as well have been a stage. He stood there, palms sweaty, facing the smooth whiteboard like it was a wall he was about to crash into. Mrs. Thompson picked up the marker. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not cruel, but certainly convinced of what was about to happen. She drew a complex equation on the board, one that spiraled with variables, roots, and exponents well above 8th grade level. She handed him the marker. "Let's see what you've got," she said, with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. Behind him, laughter barely hidden. One kid whispered, "He's about to blow it." Another said, "Bet he can't even spell equation." Jamal took the marker, and the room held its breath. He stared at the equation, chest rising and falling. For a moment, the world fell silent, not just the students. The air itself felt still. Because this moment, this quiet moment at the front of room 3002, wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about what happens when a world that mocks a genius black boy is forced to watch him rise. The marker in Jamal's hand felt heavier than it should. He stared at the whiteboard, but his mind, just for a moment, slipped backward. Back to smaller rooms, to faces that looked like his, to silences that were louder than words. In first grade, he had solved puzzles that stumped his teacher. He didn't brag. He didn't shout. He simply handed in his paper and returned to his drawing. That day, the teacher smiled tightly and wrote a note home that said, "Jamal is quiet but needs to focus more on the classwork." She missed the fact that he had finished faster than the rest. In third grade, Jamal asked if he could read ahead in his math book. The teacher said, "That's not how we do things." And when he stopped raising his hand, she noted, "Jamal shows little interest in participation." Over the years, silence was mistaken for slacking, stillness for laziness. The brilliance of a quiet black boy was invisible to a system that didn't know how to look for it. Teachers called on the loud ones, the ones who fit the mold. Jamal didn't fit. So he folded himself into the corners of classrooms and listened. He had learned early on, the world did not expect much from boys who looked like him. And still, he wrote. Late at night, after his parents had gone to bed, Jamal would flip through old textbooks they found at a yard sale. His fingers would trace the symbols, and his mind would hum like a machine, solving, sorting, seeing through the numbers to the patterns underneath. In his notebook, tucked between pages of homework, were proofs he built himself, theories he'd tried to mimic from old math magazines. Sometimes, he would sit under the cracked ceiling light in the hallway and whisper equations out loud, just to hear how they sounded. Not because anyone asked him to, but because something inside him loved the order, the beauty. The clarity math gave that life sometimes didn't. He had heard stories from his grandmother about people like Benjamin Banneker, the black man who built a clock from wood and genius. About Katherine Johnson, who sent rockets into orbit with nothing but numbers and nerves of steel. Nobody clapped for them at first, either. In the world around Jamal, students like him were often seen only through one lens. If they were quiet, they were defiant. If they were smart, it was an exception, a surprise. When the system looked at a young black boy like Jamal, it looked with suspicion before it ever looked with belief. In fifth grade, a substitute teacher had watched him sitting alone under a tree during recess, notebook open, solving a geometry puzzle he'd created from scratch. She walked over and said with a fake kind of cheer, "Shouldn't you be playing basketball with the other boys?" Jamal didn't answer, but he remembered. Every assumption echoed. They piled onto each other like bricks, not all of them loud. Many were whispered through the tone of a voice or the tilt of an eyebrow. He had grown used to it. But now, back in room 3002, under the fluorescent lights and the stifling silence, Jamal Carter stood before a classroom filled with those same assumptions. And this time he wasn't going to fold. Not today. Behind him, his notebook waited in his seat, open to a page with a half-finished proof he'd started during lunch. But at the front of the room, the real equation waited. Not just the one written on the board, but the unspoken one that had followed him since he first walked into a school. A quiet black boy plus talent minus attention equals what? Jamal gripped the marker. And slowly, without a word, he raised it to the board. The board loomed like a wall of judgment. The problem sprawled across it in sharp, confident strokes. Fractions nested within exponents, variables twisting into unfamiliar patterns, and nothing about it was simple. It was a problem designed to break someone, not teach them. Jamal stood motionless, marker in hand. The plastic felt slick beneath his fingers, the room suddenly too warm, the silence too loud. Mrs. Thompson stepped back, folding her arms with a look that said she'd seen this story play out before. "Since you seem so distracted, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cold but controlled, "let's see what's so fascinating out there." A few students stifled laughter. One boy leaned over and whispered, "He's cooked." Another added, "Watch this, he's gonna choke." Jamal heard it all. The snickers, the whispers, the rustle of paper as someone pretended to take notes while really waiting for him to fall apart. He blinked slowly. Behind him, 30 pairs of eyes dug into his back. His pulse throbbed in his ears like a drum beat. He looked at the equation again. Something inside him quivered, not fear, but something heavier. That old ache of being watched not with hope, but with doubt. And then something shifted. He thought of his mother's voice at the kitchen table, gentle but fierce. "Baby, don't let nobody measure you by their small eyes." He thought of his father who worked 2 jobs but still came home and asked, "What you learned today?" Like the answer mattered more than money. He thought of the scribbles in his notebook, the problems he solved when no one asked him to because they made him feel alive. He took a breath and then another. The marker touched the board. At first, his hand moved slowly, cautiously, testing each step like a man walking on thin ice. He isolated the first variable, balanced the equation, cross-checked the exponent. The squeak of the marker echoed through the room, each sound slicing the silence. No one laughed now. Mrs. Thompson narrowed her eyes, her arms still folded, but her posture shifting just slightly. Jamal didn't see her. He was inside the numbers now. The equation had opened to him like a doorway, and he walked through it with steady feet. Each move was deliberate, clean. He wasn't guessing. He was slicing through the problem with precision that had taken years to build alone. A girl in the front whispered, "Wait, is he solving it?" "Hold up," a boy muttered, leaning forward, eyes squinting. "He's actually doing it." Another voice, softer, said, "That's not just right, that's smart." Jamal heard none of it. He was in the rhythm now. Simplify, shift, cancel, multiply, reduce. His body relaxed as his hand flowed across the board. The marker danced. What had started as a trial was turning into a performance. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. He didn't need applause. When the final number was written, when the answer sat at the end like a period in a sentence, Jamal circled it with one smooth motion. Then slowly he stepped back. He turned to face the room. There was no smirk on his face, no triumph, just breath, steady and strong. The class was silent, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. Even the ones who had laughed earlier now looked like they'd just seen something they couldn't explain. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, staring at the board. Her eyes scanned each line. No errors, not even one. Her lips moved as she checked his logic, her brows knit in silent calculation. Then she looked at him, her voice quieter now. "This is correct." A ripple moved through the class. A few claps started, awkward at first, then stronger. Someone let out a low whistle. The sound of desks shifting as kids turned to see Jamal not as a joke, but as something else entirely. He didn't smile, but he stood a little taller. He had been called out to be humiliated. But he had answered with truth. And now, for the first time in that classroom, the silence belonged to him. Revelation at the whiteboard. The marker moved like it had a story to tell. Line by line, Jamal carved his path through the equation, each number placed with purpose, each fraction simplified with calm. He wasn't showing off. He was showing up. The classroom had fallen silent. The kind of silence you don't plan for, the kind that creeps in when the impossible starts to feel real. Eyes that once rolled were now wide open. Mouths hung slightly agape. No one dared to whisper. Even the students who had been texting beneath their desks sat frozen, caught in the gravity of what they were watching. Jamal's hand worked steady and sure. He factored the binomials with a speed that didn't come from luck but from years of quiet discipline. He flipped signs, combined like terms, and reduced the chaos on the board into clean, beautiful order. One step bled into the next like notes in a melody only he could hear. And for the first time, the classroom wasn't a battlefield. It was a stage, and the boy they'd called distracted had become the conductor. Near the window, a girl sat at the edge of her seat, whispering, "He's actually brilliant." Someone behind her muttered, "I thought he was just weird." Mrs. Thompson didn't speak. Her arms were no longer folded. She leaned slightly forward now, watching, calculating, measuring, but what she saw wasn't what she expected. Jamal paused briefly to check his work, then continued. The final lines formed into clarity. He boxed the answer gently, circled it, and set the marker down on the ledge. He exhaled, not dramatically, but deeply, like someone coming up from underwater. He turned. No grin, no smirk, just stillness. The board behind him was full, but not messy. It was clean, like a solved riddle, like a secret finally said out loud. A flash passed through his mind. His mother in the kitchen late at night, standing over a sink full of dishes, the sound of warm water and gospel humming low from a radio. She looked at him and said softly, "They may not see it now, baby, but you are light. God didn't hide you. He's letting you build heat first." He hadn't known what she meant back then. Now he did. He was light. And in that moment it filled the room. Mrs. Thompson walked toward the board slowly, as if approaching something sacred. She studied the work. Her eyes followed each line. She reached out and traced a part of the solution with her finger, double-checking. No errors. She stepped back and turned to the class. "This is correct." It wasn't loud, but the words hit like thunder. A slow ripple of clapping began, a few hands. Then more, it grew not because they were told to applaud, but because something inside them had shifted. Respect rose like steam from the floor, and it was earned. Jamal didn't move, he just breathed, eyes on no one, shoulders steady. No longer invisible. He wasn't just the quiet kid now. He was the reminder that genius doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs a moment to be seen. The apology and the offer. The bell rang with its usual shrill clang, but the energy in room 3002 had shifted. Some students still whispered, others just stared at Jamal with wide, uncertain eyes. A few patted his back as they passed by, their voices low and changed. "Yo, that was insane. Man, you really did that. I didn't know you had it like that." Jamal nodded gently, his notebook tucked tight under his arm, unsure what to say. He had always dreamed of being seen, but being seen all at once felt like walking out into a storm. "Jamal," Mrs. Thompson called from the front, "can you stay for a moment?" His classmates filed out, leaving behind the lingering scent of pencil shavings and the sound of sneakers squeaking against the tile. The door closed with a soft click. Mrs. Thompson stood by her desk, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a paper. For the first time since the school year started, she didn't look like a wall he couldn't get through. She looked human. She looked conflicted. Jamal waited in the silence. She finally spoke. "I owe you something," she said slowly. "Actually, two things." Jamal shifted his weight, unsure where this was going. She looked up at him, her voice lower now, almost hesitant. "First, I owe you an apology." The room seemed to pause. "I misjudged you," she said. "I thought your silence meant apathy. I thought your quiet meant you didn't care, and today you showed me how wrong I was." Jamal blinked, unsure what to say. No teacher had ever apologized to him, not once. "It's okay," he muttered. "No," she said gently. "It's not. I've been teaching a long time, and sometimes we forget to look deeper. We get caught in assumptions. That's on me." She paused, breathing in. "But the second thing I owe you is an opportunity." Jamal's eyes lifted. "There's a district program," she continued. "Advanced math for students who need more than what the regular classroom can give. It's not easy. It'll push you, but from what I saw today, you belong there." He hesitated, his fingers tightening on his notebook. "Me?" he asked softly. "Yes, you." She stepped forward just enough that her voice dropped with warmth. "You've got something rare, Jamal, and rare things shouldn't stay hidden." He didn't answer right away. He thought of his mother's words again. "You are light." Maybe this was the next switch being flipped. "Okay," he said at last, voice small but steady. "I'll try." Mrs. Thompson smiled, not the tight smile she wore at the start of the year, a real one. "I'll help you get there," she said. "You won't be doing it alone." And in that quiet, in the middle of a classroom that once held nothing but low expectations and forgotten potential, something shifted. A door had opened, and this time Jamal didn't hesitate to walk through it. A new path unfolds. The classroom was nothing like room 3002. This one buzzed with a quiet, focused energy. Students sat in small clusters, notebooks open, pencils moving like they were sketching ideas straight from their minds. Equations sprawled across whiteboards, graphs stretched like constellations. Jamal stood at the threshold of the advanced math room, clutching his notebook to his chest. His palms were damp. His heart beat faster than he liked. He had been invited. He belonged. But still, that old voice in the back of his head whispered, what if this was a mistake? Then he saw them, kids like him. Black and brown boys and girls leaning over problems, debating answers, laughing, thinking. Some wore braids, some wore hijabs, some wore the same worn sneakers he had on. None of them looked surprised to be there, they just looked alive. A girl looked up from her desk and nodded. "You knew?" she asked. Jamal nodded back, a little unsure. "Yeah, just started." She smiled and slid a chair out next to her. "Then come on, we're doing number theory, it's fire." He sat down, his hands still tight around his notebook. But as the lesson began and the instructor threw up a string of numbers on the board, something inside him shifted. He understood it. Not just the lesson, but the space. Here, no one stared at him like a surprise. Here, his skin wasn't the exception in the room. Here, brilliance looked like him too. And as the teacher called on another boy, dark-skinned, tall, soft-spoken, who broke down a problem with ease, Jamal caught himself smiling. Back at Riverside Middle, things changed too. He no longer sank into his seat. Students started asking him for help. At lunch, kids who'd once ignored him now pulled out worksheets and said, "Yo, Jamal, can you help me with this one?" He never said no. He'd sit with them, talk them through the process, never showing off. Just guiding, teaching like someone had once done for him, only no one ever had. Mrs. Thompson noticed. She watched him one afternoon helping two classmates by the lockers and pulled him aside after school. "You're not just a student anymore," she told him. "You're a leader now." Jamal didn't know how to respond, but he carried her words with him. The narrator's voice softens. We talk so often about equality in education, but equality means everyone gets the same. Jamal's story is a lesson in equity, giving each child what they need to rise. Because some kids are navigating more than just textbooks. They're navigating stereotypes, low expectations, invisible ceilings, and still they rise. In a system that wasn't built with him in mind, Jamal didn't just survive. He began to lead. Legacy in the making. The leaves had started to fall by the time Jamal's name was being whispered in hallways for all the right reasons. Not as a target, not as a joke, but as something new, as someone to trust. He no longer walked with his head down. He moved through Riverside Middle with quiet confidence now. Not loud, just steady. Like a flame that knew it could burn without needing to roar. It started small. Two boys who'd been struggling in math asked for help after class. "You're good at this, right?" one of them asked. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, I can show you." So he stayed after school. Then a girl from social studies asked if she could join. Then another. Within weeks, Jamal was staying 2 afternoons a week, sitting in the library with 5 or 6 students at a time, breaking things down the way no textbook ever could. They didn't just come for the math. They came for the way he looked at them, like they weren't broken, like they weren't behind, like they mattered. He never talked down to them. He just sat next to them, pointed at the problem, and said things like, "Let's figure it out together." Word spread, teachers noticed. Even Mrs. Thompson, once sharp and dismissive, now stood at the door some afternoons, just watching, as Jamal led from the center of the circle. And then came the evening his mother stood in the kitchen, arms crossed over her chest, watching him with a look that held 1,000 prayers behind it. He had just finished telling her about a boy he helped that afternoon. One who used to clown in class but was now raising his hand again. Jamal shrugged like it was no big deal. I guess he just needed someone to believe he could do it. His mother walked over, took his face in both hands, and held his gaze. "They tried to make you small," she whispered, voice thick with pride. "But baby, look at how you grew." Jamal didn't say anything. He didn't have to. That night, while the city hummed quietly outside their apartment window, Jamal sat at the kitchen table and opened a fresh notebook. But this time, he didn't write equations. He started writing names. Names of kids he wanted to help. Ideas for lessons he could share. Dreams bigger than numbers. Dreams that looked like him. Because the boy they once tried to box in had turned his light outward. And now it was catching fire. The afternoon sun poured through the school library windows, painting long streaks of gold across the floor. Jamal sat alone at a table near the back, his notebook open, pencil in hand. But today there were no equations, no graphs. No numbers, just words. He paused, then wrote slowly. "They thought my silence was empty." But it was full of fire. He leaned back, reading it again. His eyes didn't scan for errors like he did with math. He just listened. Because now the voice inside him was louder, braver. For months he had helped others find confidence in themselves. But today was different. Today he was writing for the boy he used to be, the one who sat in the back. The one who stared out the window, wishing someone saw what he carried inside. His reflection in the glass no longer looked like a shadow. It looked like a beginning. Outside the door, students passed in waves. Laughter, footsteps, the rustle of backpacks. Life moved on, but inside that room a truth sat still. The narrator's voice cuts in, warm and steady. There are many Jamals out there. Quiet, brilliant, misunderstood, not lazy, not lost. Just waiting for a teacher to look past the silence, for a classmate to ask for help instead of teasing, for a system that doesn't measure genius by how loud you speak, but how deep you think. The camera draws in slowly on Jamal's notebook, a page now filled with poetry, dreams, fragments of voice that used to stay locked in his chest. He flips to a clean page and writes, "My name is Jamal. I don't need to shout. I just needed to be heard." Fade to black. Let us build classrooms where every black child is seen, where their light isn't buried beneath bias, where justice, not judgment, leads the lesson, where opportunity is not the exception, it's the expectation. Because Jamal's story isn't rare. What's rare is when we choose to listen. Let's choose better. Let's choose to believe. Sometimes the brightest minds speak in silence, and sometimes the most powerful change begins with someone simply being seen. Jamal's story reminds us that behind every quiet face, there may be untapped brilliance waiting for one moment of belief. It reminds us to look deeper, to listen more carefully, and to never let assumptions speak louder than understanding. Let this be a gentle call to all of us, educators, parents, students, and communities, to build a world where every Black child is respected, uplifted, and given room to rise. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Unbreakable, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what this meant to you. And stay tuned, because in our next videos, we'll continue uncovering powerful, untold stories of resilience, injustice, and triumph from the Black community. Stories that will surprise you, inspire you, and make you feel deeply. These are the voices the world needs to hear, and you won't want to miss them.